I wanted to make sure I planned time so that we could have hopefully some discussion. And I'm going to tell you ahead of time that I think this will be relevant to many of you in this audience because either you're thinking about how to make better stem cell preparations, thinking about how stem cells can be used for problems in curing debilitating illnesses. And what I want to try to discuss today is what's going on currently, what are the factors that are driving stem cell-based regenerative medicine. And I want to start with just giving some loose definitions for what we mean by stem cell regenerative medicine. There are many aspects of it. This is probably the most common using hematopoietic stem cells, which are one of the best examples of transplantation or stem cell transplantation medicine. And the idea is that we have a patient or an individual that has some problem, in this case, in their blood system, in their bone marrow. They need new bone marrow stem cells. And the idea is that there's a transplantation, in this case it's allogeneic from another person, of blood stem cells, and then those cells help this person to have better health, to have an improvement in their health status. But there's also other forms of regenerative medicine. This is an example here. What I just showed you earlier was homologous. It's the tissue that's being transplanted, the source of those stem cells that are being transplanted in terms of tissues is going into the same tissue, so bone marrow to bone marrow. But there's also heterologous treatments. And in this case here, we have an individual that has a problem with their heart. And what's done here is the same types of cells as before, hematopoietic stem cells, are transplanted toward the goal of improving health in the heart. It's heterologous because these stem cells derive from the blood and they're being used to help a problem in the heart. Right? And one of the questions I want to raise today in my talk is whether or not this is going to be the most productive way to move forward. Let me just say that when in these tissue heterologous transplantations, there are several goals sometimes. Sometimes it's to actually do regeneration in the heart. Other times it's because the cells that are being transplanted, even hematopoietic stem cells, may have properties that can encourage the development, encourage the restoration of the tissue. Could be growth factors, could be even structure. And heterologous treatments, by and large now, are autologous. So it's the same basic idea in terms of heterology. Cells, in this case, taken from the bone marrow, taken from blood systems, from the patient, given back to the patient to help a problem in a different tissue. There's an awful lot of stem cell transplantation medicine going on in that type. Okay? So I started off by trying to do this on my own by looking up various databases, and in my research I discovered this paper from Lee et al. In Regenerative Medicine, just came out in 2014. If you're interested in this problem, read this paper. It is a great summary of what's been happening in stem cell transplantation medicine for the past 20 years. I drew heavily on it. You'll see it referenced throughout. It's a great starting place to pose some of the questions I want to pose today, but I encourage you to look this paper up. Is anyone here from this group? That would be terrific. Okay, so what they did was looking at databases, and this is worldwide, a variety of databases looking at data from 1992 to 2013, so it's fairly current. And they identified about 4,700 or so stem cell clinical trials. And I'll come to a moment, I'll tell you what I mean by that. But basically, there's stem cells being used in clinical studies to try to effect a cure, treatments for patients in need. Out of that 4,700 or so, they defined about 1,000 that they call novel. And that means that these are, novel in this setting means that this is a new clinical trial where there hasn't been one like it before, not the year before, not years before. And the baseline data that I want to start with is here. And it gives us a sense of the emergence of stem cell clinical trials over the last 20 years. And if you can see that, I'm actually colorblind, so it's kind of hard for me to see the color distinctions here, but there are three different colors indicated here. One of them is referred to as non-novel clinical trials. So these are stem cell transplantation trials, the number of them taking place from 1992 to about 2012. What are they? Bone marrow transplant. Primarily, they're hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, where optimization is going on. What happens if you vary what medicine is being used when they're transplanted? Whatever you change the immunosuppressive agent in allogeneic transplant, changing dose, changing order of addition. Lots of that's been going on, as you can see. It's been increasing over the years. What we're going to focus on is that 1,000 or so, which are novel. So those are clinical trials. For instance, here in 2000, there's this little blip there for novel clinical trials. It means these trials here didn't happen earlier. They're new. And they come in two main categories, and this is going to be an important point for this discussion. Ones that are involving mesenchymal stem cells and ones that are not. I did that in reverse order, but you get the picture. So what you see is out here, somewhere around about 2004 or so, these upper bars start to take off. So we start seeing a lot more of these new clinical trials that are new. Okay? So one of the things I want to talk about today is what's driving this. Can we think about what may be changing in the world, changing in science, in medicine, that's responsible for the sudden increase in the number of trials which are new, involving, in many cases, mesenchymal stem cells. I want to point out that these new stem cell clinical trials are taking place globally. And this just shows for the past, in 2014, there are about 300 new stem cell transplant clinical trials. This is where they're happening in the world. And you can see most areas this is taking place. The U.S. has a predominance of these, followed by Europe and the U.K. And China. But it's something that's happening worldwide in terms of where these trials are now taking place. Now, getting back to the question, what are the factors that are driving this increase? One of them that we might consider a priori is patient need. These trials are happening because people are looking for ways of treating illnesses that previously we haven't been able to treat. In many cases where tissues are in states of disease where they need to be replaced with new tissues, in cases of terrible debilitating injuries that are difficult to repair. Okay? But there's no reason to think that patient need itself has increased. Even if we think about the accounting for it, and the possibility that there might be events that are driving people's knowledge of stem cells so that patients in need might want more of these therapies. I want to point out some of these events. One of them is in about 1998. This is the first development of human embryonic stem cells. It potentially could have been a precursor, but I'll show there's a good argument that it isn't. The embryonic stem cell debate starts right around here in 2000, 2001, and the issue is whether or not it's proper for us to destroy human embryos in order to get embryonic stem cells, right? And so these are potential precursors where there's a lot of discussion going on about stem cell research and stem cell medicine. This could have been a driver for this. But in the U.S., where many of these trials are taking place, it's not until 2009 or 10 that there's actually funding available from the largest funder in our country, the NIH, for this. That's well after this increase has started. So we suggest that there's something else that really is a driver here as opposed to the information per se about stem cell transplantation, stem cell medicine. What else might it be? And that's the question, what are the other possibilities? Well, one of them, in terms of the correlation between the increase in activity between the new stem cell clinical trials and the involvement of companies, of industry. So this shows the public, which is the bottom part of this, versus industry's investments in stem cell transplantation clinical trials. And I told you earlier, around about 2004, 2005 is when we first see that increase in these new stem cell clinical trials. And that's about the time you start to see this increase in industry. Okay? Now, I spent a lot of time in my university days teaching students about cause and effect. This does not establish cause and effect. We have correlation, could be responsible, might not be responsible. And what I'm going to suggest to you today, that this is not really the main driver. It reflects the main driver. Now, when I get to the main driver, that's just going to be a hypothesis too. I'm not going to be able to establish cause and effect either, but it looks like there's something else that's responsible not only for the increase in the new clinical trials, but also the increase in the industry being involved. One of the things we can say about industry, it arrives on the scene when technologies start to mature, when you can see pathways from what we do in laboratories to what we can do to help patients. And that's why they're showing up here, because there's been a technical development. And the evidence for that technical development is here, or coming up soon. That's my precursor slide. We've been looking at it a lot. If you look now at, publications, using PubMed as an indicator of this, for mesenchymal stem cell publications around about 2004, it just takes off, right? It takes off around the time here. This is just a compression of what I've been showing you all along. When you start to see these new, both involving mesenchymal stem cells and not involving mesenchymal stem cells, you see this increase, okay? So what I'm suggesting to you today, and it's been a concern of mine, is that a lot of what we're doing in terms of new stem cell medicine, stem cell clinical trials, is driven by what stem cells we have available. Makes sense. If you can't get cells to do transplant, you don't get to do any stem cell medicine. The problem is that we may, and one of the theses of my talk, we may be driven too much by availability in terms of thinking about biological rationale. Okay? Now, this paper that I introduced you to gives some evidence for this, what I'm showing you here, that the reason there are so many new clinical trials is because of the activity in coming up with sources of cells to do transplantation, stem cell transplantation medicine with. All right, so again, this is from Lee et al. And what I want to show you here is this sort of disconnect between stem cell availability. So this is to show that stem cell availability is a major factor. And in a moment, I'll show you a disconnect between that and what types of treatments are being developed. So if you look here for that 1,000 new clinical trials, that stem cell clinical trials that happened in the last 10 years or so, what you see is that most of it, almost 80% of it, is using stem cells. This is stem cell type that are either what we can get easily, bone marrow, mobilized peripheral blood, cord blood, the hematopoietic systems, about 40% of that. The other 40% is mesenchymal cells. Okay. Now, if you ask where are those cells coming from, I've sort of already indicated a lot coming from bone marrow. Maybe 40% of the cells are coming out of a bone marrow. A lot of these are, in fact, mesenchymal cells coming out of bone marrow, not hematopoietic stem cells per se. And then there are these new places, umbilical cord people are familiar with, but there's also an increase in adipose tissue. Almost all of this is producing these mesenchymal stem cells. Okay? There's the availability. The question is, what are we doing with the cells? Now, for that 1,000 new stem cell transplant clinical trials, about 90% of them, remember the number, the denominator here is 1,000 or so, are regeneration. These are efforts to restore, renew, reconstitute tissues that are either diseased or damaged. All right, so there are other things going on as well as some non-regeneratives, but this is a big part of this. And when we look now at this slide here is ask, what are we targeting for that regeneration? Well, heart's a pretty big one. These immune system ones are immune modulation. So you're trying to transplant something else, and you put in cells to prevent the immune system from doing its job and rejecting it. There's central nervous system, which is a large one. These are diseases like stroke, where cells are being injected to help patients recover sooner, maybe limit the progression of their stroke. Right. So, but when you go over here for stem cell type, where are the heart cells? They don't make this list. Where are the neural cells? They don't make this list. So these are not because of homologous therapies. They are heterologous. And the majority of these are getting what you see here in terms of the majority of cells that are available. They're hematopoietic cells that are being used for a variety of treatments in heterologous states. That's why I started with that slide. And the other large category is mesenchymal stem cells. So here's a take-home message from today that I want to sort of open up this meeting with us thinking about, because it's one of those things that's very prevalent and we just kind of ignore it. I've started writing about it because I think it's something we got to think about in terms of how we're putting our resources and whether or not science is driving our medicine as opposed to technical accessibility kinds of factors. So what I suggest is that, yes, there are some important factors that are driving this current regenerative medicine practice of increased stem cell clinical trials. Patients are clearly important because we are doing these things hopefully to help people who are in need of better care. Patient advocate groups have been very active in this. Physicians, of course, and scientists, we are drivers for this activity as well. Government agents that support the research. And I mentioned specifically commercial interests. Right? That's the infusion of industry in this new discipline in medicine. But right now, the main driver is what cells we have available to try. So even the stem cell availability is actually, as I suggest, is driving commercial interest. The question for us in this field as investigators is whether this is the best basis for us to be doing clinical trials, right? And how should we think about the fact that we have many clinical trials that are driven by this heterologous because of availability? And do we get to clinical success in this pathway? And is there something else we could be doing that might get us there sooner? So I wouldn't have brought this up if I didn't think there was something else we should be doing. So here's where we are. We have a lot of empirical testing going on in these clinical trials. And the question is whether how much of that empirical testing has attention of where we are in terms of understanding the biology of the cells that we're transplanting. So the question here is, can heterologous tissue stem cell transplantation succeed? All right, so we talked about the two forms of it. It can be allogeneic, where a heterologous stem cell type is transplanted into a patient to hopefully help them with their disease. And I mentioned earlier, lots of times right now, this is a regenerative approach. We're trying to produce heart cells. The minority of these cases is where the mesenchymal stem cells are being transplanted to hopefully supply some needed growth factor or cytokines. And autologous is driving this because it's another technical issue, of course. It's a lot more straightforward to do autologous than it is to do allogeneic because of the immune system issues. So there's a lot going on where patients' mesenchymal stem cells and hematopoietic stem cells are being put in other areas where they have a need for tissue restoration as a potential cure. And I want to suggest that we need to be doing more of this. Because you can ask, why are those the only cells available? Or why are those the main cells available? Well, in the case of mesenchymal stem cells, they're very proliferative. So you can generate volumes for lots of types of things. You can even talk about in terms of clinical trials having renewable samples of them. Even though there is good evidence that they're changing over time, you can generate those volumes. In the case of hematopoietic stem cells, although we don't have good tools for expanding them in culture, we know how to get them. They're fairly accessible. And so those are the drivers for those two, because they're easy to get and they're easier to grow. Our other adult stem cells for these types of transplantation medicine trials don't fit either one of those. They're difficult to get. Sometimes we can't even identify and count them. Think about things like liver stem cells or kidney stem cells or heart stem cells, and they're difficult to grow. But there is new data coming out that they can be grown. Some of them can be, but I think that's a place where the field needs to put more effort than we have right now. Because if you had a choice as a patient, you have an ailing organ, it needs better cells. What type of stem cell would you prefer? So the empirical way says, well, mesenchymal stem cells have a lot of neat properties. We don't understand them all. Let's just try them because we can. As opposed to, we need to have a better biological basis for trying them, better understanding. And if we don't, we should spend our time trying to expand and identify the cells that are ideal for the solution. And I think I'll leave this slide up. Oh, I didn't. Will we go back? Yeah. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention. Let us know if we have time for some questions.
more stem cells, but I'm pretty loud.
Could you tell us who you are when you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Wendy Weston. I'm from 5X Biomedical, and it seems that characterizing, like you said, is very important in knowing what you're getting. But some of the research that has been done has shown that it only takes a few of the right stem cells. So the research, in my opinion, should be going towards what is the right kind of stem cells, getting the right kind, and what is the proper way to deliver those stem cells so that we don't lose them. Do you understand what I mean?
Absolutely. So that's a great qualification. One of the things I think sometimes that gets lost in the technology development is that bone marrow transplant shows us we don't need to do expansion to affect cures. But when you're in the realm of trying to make more for more people, in the industrial setting where you want to be able to produce these cells and process them so they be available to more people, then expansion becomes an issue. So depends on the setting, not required, but we're in a much better place if we can produce them. And the characterization, absolutely. Getting better characterization of the cells, where they reside, what you can do and can't do with them in terms of maintaining the properties is very important. Yeah, thank you for that. Here.
Can you identify yourself as well, please?
Yes. I am Purwati from Indonesia, Surabaya. So it's very interesting. New slide, stem cell use in medical increasing by the time. As we know, a stem cell is a transitional research so for clinical trial. So I want, my question is, how you know about the result of successfully of stem cell, especially in the what kind of disease or kind of source, because the clinical trial especially is to make a standardization for international, maybe for a good standardization to stem cell treatment. Thank you.
So is the question, how do you know that these are...
The result of successfully of stem cell, especially what kind of disease, what kind of use of kind of stem cell and source, maybe.
Yeah, so a lot of these trials are ongoing. So in some ways, I'm sort of anticipating problems. But ultimately, many of these trials are going to give reports. And we'll find out over time, this chart here, there'll be information about what types of trials were successful and what won't. I mean, you're right, that's what these clinical trials are for. But we still have choices to make in terms of which new trials we're going to start. So these are the kinds of ideas I think should be in that discussion. This question right there.
Dr. Ramo from UCSS, I would like to know to what degree mesenchymal cells are actually analogous and how different they are, and how the variations of mesenchymal cells can reflect onto treatments. To what degree is diversity here relevant for that? Thank you.
Yeah, so there are better experts here. There are actually experts here on mesenchymal stem cells. I'm not particularly one of those. The question is, does it matter? So we know things about their properties. We know about variability. We know about growth. We know we can, but neat thing about mesenchymal stem cells, you can engineer them. You can have them make some other factor that you think you need. So the real issue is, when they're in this heterologous site, how well do they work there? And there are those who would say, and there are animal studies going on as well to address some of these issues. And to a certain extent, you know, at some point one has to ask these questions in humans, either starting with phase 1 trials. So I don't think we know. What I'm suggesting is we have an awful lot of this going on. I hope we're right to a certain extent about it.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed. And I agree with you that we should be more careful about the biology of the cells that we need to transplant. But I think we have also to admit that we have learned a lot from the MSC transplantation. And I think it gave, at least in, I mean, I will make one of my 2 presentations, the one on Wednesday, it actually reflects your I will try to underline how much is important in regenerative medicine, not only to have cells that become the cells that you would like, but that you have a sort of tissue repair. So what mesenchymal stromal cells have been teaching us during this year, I think is a new way to look at regenerative medicine. I'm not saying that it's the only one, but I think it's complementing. And for that, so to have a tissue repair, so that you are trying to get rid of inflammatory processes, fibrotic processes, you probably don't need, I mean, you can use mesenchymal cells, and maybe within the different sources of mesenchymal stromal cells, you can find the one that better reflects what you want to do in a specific tissue. But I think more or less they're all doing the same. So I think it's, I take your presentation as a sort of provoking us, and I think it's very good, it's relevant, but I also am trying to defend a little bit the mesenchymal.
Well, I think the nuance here is that there are applications that make sense based on the biology that we know. But what's happening is, since most of what's happening is regenerative, in those cases, there's a lot of examples where these cells are being transplanted because they're available, especially ones that are adipose-derived as well. So I think we need to have that kind of judgment, if you will, in terms of what's the better application based on what we know about their biology. I have only mentioned clinical trials that are approved by some government agency. I have not mentioned the many, many more hundreds of treatments that are taking place off our radar screen. Okay? That's a whole nother topic, and there's not a lot of really good data about the extent of that, but that's one of the concerns. That availability drives a lot of research, which you would look at and say, a priori, this may not be the best strategy of taking. Yes, right here.
Chris Bradley, Labs Biologics. I think it's worthwhile. I mean, I like what you're saying. We should be careful. There's a lot of things. It feels like the Wild Wild West a little bit, and some of the stem cell trials, well, not so much the clinical trials that you hear about, but like, I don't know, plastic surgeons or a lot of other clinical specialists who advertise stem cell therapies. And but is it really worth lamenting as much as you advocate if we don't understand all the biology? We're never going to understand all the biology. I mean, when you hear that microRNAs and their control of gene expression is barely understood, and they could be at play. I'm encouraged by the fact that we're moving forward, although I understand the need to be careful. I just don't know if I'm sold on the argument that we need to lament the fact that we don't understand all the biology behind it.
So I'm really never advocating for lamenting. I'm suggesting that maybe we could be doing it differently. So that's really the question. You're right. At some point, we have to get to a point where we have to do experiments. And we have to sometimes do those experiments with patients. But that's not a trivial statement, doing it with patients, and we should be in our best suit when we're doing it. And so some of that is spending more time thinking about the biology. As Onelia indicated here, there are some cases where it makes sense, but there are other cases where you wouldn't give mesenchymal stem cells for somebody who needs a bone marrow transplant. And there are experiments, there are clinical trials going on to have that look. So it's about just sort of taking a look at the landscape as shown here, asking what are those things that are going on which might, with more thought, we would do differently, because our resources are limited, and so is our time. Yeah. Got one more?
One more, yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Then,
Actually, it's been suggested that you should use mesenchymal stem cells for bone marrow transplant due to reestablishment of the niche for bone marrow transplant in order to take.
so that's another good example where the biology makes sense to do that, because we're still looking for ways to improve bone marrow transplantation for hematopoietic stem cell replacement. Yeah. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you very much, James. Appreciate it.
I'm going to go down so I can
Let me
hear.
give you your certificate.
Oh, I got it.
It's important.